Right, so this is going to be a pretty quick review of MPEP 800, which is based on restriction and double patenting. So kind of starting out with the basis of restriction. So restriction is the core principles of it is going to be when there's two or more independent or distinct inventions present in an application. The applicant must elect an invention for prosecution. The applicant can pursue the claims that were unelected in a divisional application, and then they are then exempt from a double patenting rejection. So that's kind of why these are double patenting and restriction are in the same chapter, because divisional claims which were filed as a result of a restriction requirement, those cannot be rejected on the basis of double patenting. So then claims which are drawn to multiple species, one species may need to be elected depending on what the examiner finds. If there are linking claims, then those are examined with an elected invention. For transitional applications, this was just a quick note, those are ones which are pending for more than 3 years on 6/8/95, and those can be overcome by the payment of a fee. So if you get a restriction requirement in one of those, or a question about restriction requirement in one of those, then all that needs to happen is just a payment of a fee, which is kind of nice for those people. So then further restriction basis. So a generic claim cannot be or define species, but it can cover multiple species. And so there may need to be an election out of those species. There are then subcombinations and combinations. So an examiner must show that a combination does not require the particulars of a subcombination, and a subcombination has to be able to stand alone in utility. A restriction can be between the members of a Marcouche group. So if you remember those, that's when there's a listing where it's separated by and or, and so there can be massive lists of those that are by an application. So if an examiner sees that, they're just going to go ahead and make a restriction to simplify the scope of the application. Going back to this combination, subcombination, these are pretty complicated questions and kind of theories, and so definitely recommend reading that in the MPEP 800 and going over exactly what a combination and subcombination restrictions are, how those are made. So then for the product and apparatus distinction, so remember those can be the same thing in a lot of cases, but if a process can be practiced by another apparatus or by hand, or an apparatus as claimed can be used to practice another and materially different process. So, right, so if a process can be practiced by another apparatus, or if it's something that can be just done by hand, right? So in the cases of certain applications that talk about the if they're doing some sort of mathematical process, if it's something that can be done by hand, then that's not necessarily something that could be a distinction that can be made. And if an apparatus can be used to do different processes, then that would require a distinction. So then if there is an apparatus and product distinction, an apparatus is not an obvious apparatus for making a product, or a product claim can be made by another and materially different apparatus. And so again, kind of confusing aspects, but I would definitely recommend reading about those. As far as how to respond to a restriction, you have to elect a claim group. If you don't elect a claim group, then that reply is not considered complete. You can elect with traverse, that's totally fine, but an election still has to be made. And so a traverse, that is just where you, in some sort of writing, write an argument about how they are not patentably distinct and they should be within the same application. And a restriction can be communicated via a phone interview. And if an election is made, and it's not required to be made over a phone interview, then the next office action will have to acknowledge this response. And the application can in turn, they can affirm the rejection, or they can argue in support of traverse where necessary in this next office action, in response to the office action which acknowledged the response. So then comes the basis of double patenting. So it's kind of common sense, right? You can't have two patents claiming the same invention. That's just not really fair as far as what the purpose of the patent office is, wherein it's to get, inventions out to the public. So this is appropriate where the invention is disclosed but not claimed by another application or patent. And this can also be done in the case where it is claimed by another application or patent. It doesn't have to be identical. In some cases, it can just be disclosed but not claimed. And this is issued when there's one inventor in common but no ownership, or ownership and no inventor in common. There are two types of double patenting. There's the same invention when a question will say it claims the same invention, and that would be a statutory double patenting. And this one cannot be overcome with a terminal disclaimer. We'll talk a little bit about how that can be overcome, but it cannot be overcome with a terminal disclaimer. Then there's the obviousness type of double patenting. And so this is when it discloses but does not claim. And this is considered non-statutory. And this one can be overcome with a terminal disclaimer, but it's improper if a division is necessary by restriction. So remember, restriction, that happens in the cases of patentably distinct. And so if something is considered patentably distinct, the examiner can't turn around and reject it for an obviousness non-statutory, because an examiner in another application already said that it wasn't patentably distinct, or that it was patentably distinct. So you can't make that same argument. However, if it's a division with almost the same invention, then you can get a rejection under statutory. For double patenting help, there's just a little bit more about that. The flowcharts within the MPEP 804 are very helpful. I would recommend, if you have a question that's not immediately clear what to do with double patenting, I would recommend immediately going to these flowcharts, because it talks about between applications, between an application and a patent, between reissue, between pre-AA, AIA. It's honestly more helpful than any other tutorial could be. If there's no common assignee or applicant or inventor, then it would just be a normal rejection under 102A2. So that was a little bit confusing to me at first. So that was just helpful to know, okay, this isn't going to happen if there is some sort of common entity between these two applications or an application and a patent. But if there's nothing in common, then it would just be a normal 102A2 rejection. This can arise between pending applications or a pending application and a patent, but not two patents, because then that would be a different procedure. It can also come up during your re-examination proceeding, as you can imagine. So if something has been issued or is being contested in any case, then it can be then that can be a substantial new question of patentability. And then how to overcome a provisional non-statutory. That's going to be by arguing that the inventions are patentably distinct. So saying, no, these are not obvious within each other, they are distinct. Terminal disclaimers we've mentioned before. And then how to overcome a provisional statutory double patenting. You can cancel or amend the conflicting claims. And so provisional, remember, when you hear provisional, that means that they are both unpublished applications, or at least one of them is an unpublished application. So then provisional rejections, to kind of compare those a little bit further, there's two types. So there's provisional 102E or 102A2 rejections. So provisional rejections based purely on prior art. Those ones, there can be squaring back for 102E or just general, however you would overcome 102A2 rejections. That is based on the disclosure only. And that's only possible if it's commonly owned, assigned, or invented. And that can be avoided by filing two applications on the same day. And I'm a little bit confused as to what that is saying, but I believe that it would, yeah, I'm not totally sure. So I would maybe read on that a little bit further. But that is just what some things I've read have said, is that it can be avoided by filing two applications on the same day. But then I guess in that case, they wouldn't be able to be used as art against each other in that regard. It could also be overcome by merging into a continuation in part or showing common ownership at the time of invention. Provisional double patenting, that can be a non-statutory obviousness overcome with terminal disclaimer. If it's a statutory same invention, it's not curable, right? So you'd have to either cancel those claims, amend them in some way to completely overcome it. And that's only possible with common ownership or invention. And it's all based on what is claimed. So then as far as strange scenarios, these are just some things that when you're reading through the 800, I think that you'll see a lot of these. And so helpful to go over maybe a little bit. So there's the non-statutory double patenting issue, which can happen with a reissue patent or in any sort of reexamination. So if there's a non-statutory patent or double patenting issue, then that would most likely raise a substantial question of patentability in the case of reexamination. I would look at MPEP 2258 because there's a lot of aspects to what that would look like in a reexamination. So kind of diving into that, reading some of those sections is very interesting and very helpful. To kind of do a test for double patenting. If there's a claim in an application which could be infringed without infringing a corresponding claim in a patent, then that might be a non-statutory. So if a halogen is being claimed in a patent and a chlorine in a patent application, that's not identical or exactly the same. So you'll want to look for broader claims, which would not necessarily count as statutory. So if that claim could be infringed without infringing another claim, then it would not count as statutory. So kind of go into more that a little bit again in the MPEP. So then the terminal disclaimer again does not matter in statutory. So that could be definitely an area which could be ripe for questions of how to overcome a statutory, and it's never going to be the answer that includes a terminal disclaimer for statutory. A non-statutory rejection when at least one part of the invention is not patentably distinct. So it would anticipate, but it's not statutory. But the patent is subject to a JRA. So that can happen. So it's commonly owned. It's not patentably distinct. Even if it's under JRA, it can still be rejected. And there's a lot more nuances to that. Again, I would read MPEP 804 maybe once or twice if any of that is confusing or not clear, which I probably haven't helped in either of those regards. So I think that is it. So hopefully that will help as you're going through MPEP 804. Honestly, I think the best help for this chapter is to just read it. But hopefully this just provides a good basis. Thank you.